Unexpected Cargo by Mariah Smith. Read to you by the author. Chapter 1. Running. A desperate man fled through the desolate landscape east towards the safety of the weatherstones ahead. He hoped he had lost his pursuers for good this time. The day was already beginning to grow hot, and he carried no water, no food, and no gear to help him to survive for long, and he needed to find shelter from the desert sun until nightfall. His dust-colored robes and pants billowed back in the rising wind, and he worried that a sandstorm might be approaching. It would be a blessing if he found shelter in time. Johnathan Taylor Smith, who was also known as Desert Rat, didn't really know why he was being pursued so determinedly across the Red Sands Desert by King Richard's personal guards. He was just a political nobody that transported cargo and passengers, offered his services on various trades and general labor now and again. He had made himself an excellent reputation of always delivering his cargo to where it needed to go on time. Admittedly, not all his cargo and business ventures were technically legal, but he never hauled anything immoral like slaves bound for the market except for the rare occasions when he planned to liberate them, narcotics for pleasure, or cargo that meant for harm like weapons. Of course, his trade might have been the reason why he was being hunted, Johnny reflected as he tried to run even faster in spite of his exhaustion. They thought that he had something they wanted. Just the night before, they had captured his sandship, a kind of multifunctional low-flying hovercraft that resembled a train. After a long chase along a dirt road that led away from the little trading post he had just left behind at breakneck speed of nearly 200 miles per hour. To the observer, his rust-colored vessel looked like a boxy and ponderous near derelict, but was capable of going over terrain that most wheeled vehicles would have difficulty and found impossible to traverse. His sandship could travel at greater speeds than one's initial impression would suggest, as it sat still or floated slowly, almost silently over the ground. It could turn on a stone, stop dead in a heartbeat, and accelerate from 0 to 180 in 60 seconds flat. Its interior and exterior were spelled to handle the physical stresses of sudden shifts in speed without damaging itself, its cargo, or its passengers. No matter how fast his sandship sped above the ground, his ship and his cargo never suffered from the additional G-forces. The spells kept the gravity at a steady normal, as if it were standing still. Johnny mentally cursed and mourned his loss of his sandship as he panted through parched lips and his thick leather boots beat the ground with every running step. It had been his home as well as his main source of livelihood, and he was uncertain if he would ever get it back. However, he was not so blinded by the loss of all his possessions that he couldn't remember to be grateful that he escaped before the guards or Prince Richard decided on the best way to kill him. And he thanked the goddess of all creation that with every fibre of his being they didn't catch Goldie and Little Girl. They would have killed Goldie outright and sold Little Girl back into slavery as a gladiator in the worst blood sport events some of the oasis towns had to offer. The very thought of Goldie dead and Little Girl winding up mad and broken of spirit from the abuse of her captors and fighting for life and death battles just for entertainment squeezed his heart with fear and worry. He would die to protect them both. He spared a glance up at the sky and was rewarded once again with the form of a young dragon leading him on towards the safety of the rocks and water just ahead. She carried what little supplies she managed to recover, with Goldie clinging to the base of her neck. This was the dragon he had rescued from slavery and then adopted as his own daughter. He called her Little Girl because he couldn't think of what else to call her, and she refused to respond to any other name. It wasn't her true name. Neither he nor Little Girl knew it. They hoped to find it together someday, if they survived being hunted. Little Girl would have let him ride her across the skies along with the rest of what she was carrying if she could have, but she was still too small to bear up his weight. In her true form she was not much bigger than a Great Dane, and she was yet unable to make herself any bigger by shape-shifting alone. One day she would grow to the size of an African bull elephant, but she was only about 10 years old, not much more than a baby in dragon terms. She could only lead him on and carry Goldie, the female desert rat he had befriended as a boy. He staggered up the long, steep grade that led up to the big jagged rocks he was headed for. Just a bit farther, then they could rest. Even now he could see the cave entrance that didn't look like more than a mere shallow crack. He knew there was a concealed passage just to the right once he squeezed past the narrow opening. There was good shelter inside, and a pool of spring water. Its overflow trickled further back into the cave system, so no one from the outside would discover there was water here. Unless they had the assistance of a desert rat, a dragon's unfailing ability to find water even when it was miles away, plus his own working knowledge of the local landscape. His hunters neither had the assistance of his companions nor possessed his intimate knowledge of the desert. No self-respecting dragon would willingly permit herself to be domesticated by anyone, and the royal guards hated desert rats. Like most city dwellers, they tended to kill them on sight whenever possible. which was not easy to do. Desert rats were intelligent, opportunistic, and highly alert and magically gifted. Anyone trading in grains or other edible foodstuffs had a terrible time keeping the tenacious rodents out of their stores. They could bring a trader to ruin in a matter of days without the proper words to keep them out. Johnny stumbled and fell gasping. Another one of those damn cramps had him in his grips again. He didn't know the source of what ailed him, though he suspected magic. The source of that magic might have been the princess that found him 8 days before. She was recently widowed when her husband was killed for the throne by his younger brother. She had fled for her life, found Johnny, and asked for his help. But one look at those big dark eyes tearing up after he initially refused her, and he had to relent. Johnny was tough as nails, resourceful, and capable of cold practicality when needed. Yet by no means was he heartless. It was both his strength and sometimes his weakness. His good nature got him into trouble more than once in his 30 years of life. The princess was a competent white witch. She had drugged him somehow, or cast a sleep spell on him, shortly after he agreed to help her. When he had awakened, she had given him the royal seal, asked him to keep it safe for her until she would contact him again, and requested its return. He accepted the task along with 25 pieces of gold as a retainer. Yet he had sensed some other motive, and that keeping the royal seal safe was just a cover for the real reason she needed his help. Before he could discover the truth, they had been attacked by Prince Richard's guards. He made his escape at Princess Elena's barked command to go, while her own guards fought to protect her. He liked Princess Elena, but he wanted nothing to do with politics. Getting too much attention from royalty meant they might discover his less than illegal cargo he sometimes carried. He would honor the contract that he made with the princess to the best of his ability. He had a reputation to maintain. Besides, Elena could take care of herself. In addition to her personal guards, she was powerful in her magics. Johnny had no knack for spells himself, so he could not divine what the princess had done to him while he lay in his enchanted stupor, nor had he been able to ask any practitioners of magic along his usual trade routes. Since agreeing to help the princess, every time he stopped more than a few hours, Prince Richard's guards would find him again. Why Prince Richard wanted that stupid hunk of metal bad enough to kill him for, he didn't know. The cramp started just 12 hours after he escaped the capture from the royal guards. There started as annoying twinges he forgot about as soon as they passed, but it steadily became worse. The cramps would go from a dull pain nothing would fix to an so agonizing that they left him sick and weak until it passed and he could catch his breath. The constant dull pain passed in a couple of days, but the periodic attacks would come and go without warning. After 4 days of this, he realized he couldn't continue his business while trying to hide from the guards. So he stocked up on extra supplies and headed out for the deep desert, intending to stay there until things cooled down and Prince Richard lost interest in him. For 3 days, the ruse seemed to work. Relatively few people dared to live in the largely unmapped and completely untamed wilderness where water sources were unknown to the city dwellers and royal houses of the Red Sands. Johnny had grown up there and lived with a nomadic tribe of honorable thieves since he was 12 years old. He knew how to survive in the desert far better than any of the royal guards that were chasing him. Then somehow they located him, after he had passed briefly through a teeny trading post looking for any useful gossip. They chased him down with their heavy-wheeled vehicles after he and his family had fled back into the Dune Lady, driving away as fast as his sandship could go. He might have gotten away if they didn't have a powerful armor-piercing rifle that took out his main engine just before he could make it to the terrain too rough for them to cross any great speed. Little girl had been sitting in the passenger seat in her child form, holding Goldie in her lap, when the sandship suddenly dropped out of the air and skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust, nearly tipping over sideways more than once as it came to rest. "Get out!" Johnny had ordered desperately as he leaned over them and shoved open the passenger door. "Take Goldie and fly away from here. Go find the other dragons and stay with them. I'll catch up when I can." "Daddy, no!" she cried in protest as she hugged the frightened rat to her bare chest, terrified tears running down her cheeks. Already he could hear the guards approaching through the rapidly dissipating dust cloud. He couldn't fight them all, defend them both, and he wasn't fast enough to escape them on foot. He had to get little girl to flee. "Go!" he shouted at her with a gentle shove towards the open door. "Fly into the sun fast as you can. Do it now!" With a sob, the brave and beautiful child tumbled out the passenger door and shifted into her true form, with Goldie still in her arms. She did as she was told, flying to the sun as fast as she could. The guards fired their guns at her. Blinded by the light of the sun, they missed their target, and she was soon out of sight altogether. They hauled him out of his broken ship and attempted to subdue him with great difficulty. He knew he couldn't fight them all, but he was determined to kill as many as he could before they killed him. He could at least buy little girl and Goldie some more time to get away. He managed to break free of the first guard that grabbed him, killing that one first with his pistol and then several more. They rushed him before he could reload, but he managed to kill 3 more with his curved short sword. He might have brought down a few more, possibly even escaped in spite of his initial misgivings, if he hadn't come down with another attack of those damn debilitating cramps that might have caught him by surprise and involuntarily doubled him over in agony. Johnny cursed the princess under his breath, face pressed into the dirt, as they had pinned him to the ground, and took his sword. They tied his hands behind his back with rough hemp ropes and hobbled his feet and stood him up again. He watched helplessly as they ransacked his sandship's cargo hold, tore up his and little girl's few personal belongings, and maliciously blew small holes in his ship's hull with their firearms as they finished with their reckless search of his ship's interior. They found the seal. He didn't have time to hide the troublesome thing while he was busy running and hiding in the oasis towns that were his usual haunts. They officially declared him a thief, a murderer, and a traitor to the crown, and he was to wait a judgment by His Highness King Richard, blah, blah, blah. Johnny didn't care. All he wanted to was escape with his sandship if possible and find little girl and Goldie. He wasn't loyal to any established government. How could he be a traitor to a kingdom that he was not a citizen of? The sun was setting when he finally had been captured. He soon learned that Prince Richard himself was coming in person to see him. The guard's orders were to remain until he arrived early in the next morning. Johnny's heart sank. A personal visit by royalty in the middle of nowhere couldn't be good news. Out here, one could get away with murder and worse without anyone in polite society being the wiser. The guards didn't feed him or give him any water. They kept his confiscated supplies on their own to themselves. Laughing and gaming with cards or dice, they would sometimes try to torment him by offering him food and water, then denying it. After the second time, Johnny just ignored them, lay down and tried to rest as the night cooled uncomfortably. He didn't know how long he lay there, shivering in the still warm sand and the cold air. They had not provided him with a fire to keep warm, and his only company was a single guard that watched over him grimly. It was clear to Johnny that he would rather be gaming with the others. Some time later he heard the guard say with a nasty chuckle, "Have a drink!" Johnny opened his eyes and then rolled out of the way, barely in time to avoid being urinated on. The guards all looked up, laughed at him, and cheered his antagonist as he put his private parts back into his loose-fitting gray pants. They laughed again when Johnny doubled over in pain as he lay on his side, trying not to cry out as his lower belly cramped up. The mysterious attacks never lasted long, but they left him sweating and sick to his stomach. So far he managed to avoid vomiting. He needed to conserve his body fluids as much as possible. He didn't know how he was going to escape in his current condition, but he was determined to try once the opportunity presented itself. Until then, he let the guards think he was completely subdued. He tried to make himself comfortable on the sand again, trying not to shiver, trying to will his stomach to settle, and trying to ignore the increasing ache in his limbs for being tied up for so long. Then, to everyone's surprise, off to the west, came a sweet singing voice with words no one could quite make out. It was haunting, achingly beautiful, and filled with such longing that tears were brought to Johnny's eyes. He knew who it was and prayed that little girl would come back to her senses and fly away again. Even a few royal guards started to sniffle quietly. It would take a heart of stone not to be moved by little girl's singing. Their leader barked an order for some of his underlings to go find the singer and bring her to him. While everyone was distracted by little girl, there was a soft, almost inaudible scuffling coming up from behind him, and then a tugging sensation at his wrists. Johnny was smiled. He didn't know whether to praise or reprimand little girl and Goldie for coming up with this plan. He feared that they maybe all be killed before he got the chance to do either. Goldie continued to gnaw as fast as she could through the tough ropes at his wrist from inside his left sleeve so the guards wouldn't spot her. It was a good thing that Johnny's sleeves were so loose-fitting because Goldie was the size of a small domestic cat. In about 30 seconds his rat's teeth made short work of the rough hemp rope, and then she scrambled silently to chew through the rope binding his feet while hiding inside his loose pants leg. By now all the guards were straining to see who the singer was through the darkness of the moonless night. Little girl kept eluding the guards hunting her as she kept singing. No easy feat, even for a dragon. Johnny resisted the urge to sit up and stretch his limbs and instead remained unmoving with his hands still behind his back. He planned to wait till the last second to make a run for it. He looked up carefully at the guard standing next to him. He was staring fixedly to the west, head slightly cocked and listening intently. Goldie cut his ankles free and hurried back to his hands, pressing her furry back into his palms. To his surprise, a small sheathed hunting knife was strapped to her back by a leather cord. He grasped the hilt with his right hand, and Goldie backed up to free the blade from its sheath. Suddenly she leapt onto Johnny's shoulder and then launched herself at the guard's black-bearded face. She went for his eyes, viciously tearing at them with her sharp rat teeth before the man managed to dislodge his attacker. Johnny was on him a second after the guard had roughly dislodged the rat from his face with a startled cry of pain and revulsion. In one practiced move, slit his throat, him from calling for help or try to stop Johnny from escaping. His limbs aching and stiff, Johnny nonetheless managed to flee with as much speed as his long legs would carry him, a blood-stained goalie following close behind at his heels. Fortunately, none of the blood was hers. She had managed to escape injury when the guard had thrown her. It only took a few seconds for his captors to realize what happened, and they were after him with shouts and ringing explosions of gunfire. Little girl circled silently as an owl above Johnny, just out of range of the firelight, so she was nearly invisible in the darkness. Whenever a guard got too close to her father, she spat fireballs at them with deadly accuracy, and neatly evaded being shot by their fellows by flying quickly away from the area she launched her fireballs, making herself an unpredictable and elusive target. She hated to use her fire on living things, but she would not allow the men to hurt her father. Johnny ignored the screams as they burned and fled even deeper and deeper into the desert. He stayed in the scant scrub and rocky places where the guards' vehicles couldn't go as easily as he and his companions did. The guards knew that, and so they continued to chase him on foot, but they couldn't keep up for long. For all their special training, compared to him, they were soft and a little out of shape. They couldn't run in the desert all night with barely a pause. Johnny, however, could, because he had great stamina built up from many years of hard work in harsh conditions. And he had two other boons in his favor that they didn't have. He had a dragon, and a high steep cliff looming up ahead of him, at just inches above 6 feet tall. Johnny knew that his lean frame was too much weight for a little girl to carry any distance. However, she was just strong enough to slow his fall. "We got him, men!" shouted the leader from some distance behind as they tracked him with their electric torches. They saw the cliff, too, and assumed he would stop once they got to the edge. "Goldie," he panted as he pointed to the cliff's edge. "Okay, go," she squeaked as she guessed his plan. "Meet you below." Then she was gone, vanished into thin air. Trusting that little girl would see what he was up to in total confidence in her, almost heedless of his footing as he fled towards the cliff. "Hey, he's going to jump!" someone shouted. Zing! A bullet was fired at his shoulder with the intent of slowing him down, but it missed in a flash of greenish light he saw at the corner of his eye. Little girl hit the marksman in the chest with a fireball. He fell screaming and rolling in the dirt, trying to put it out. Too busy running for his life to contemplate the significance of what he had just seen, in that green flash of light, Johnny filed away in his mind for later and kept moving. "He's wounded!" another guard shouted. "Shit! Bang, bang! Where is that fire coming from? Watch out! Hurry up! Don't let the prisoner get away!" The shouts of the guards barely registered in Johnny's mind. Just then he reached the edge of the cliff, heart leaping even higher into his throat than he knew possible. He gathered himself up and jumped as hard as he could before he lost his nerve. Little girl screaming in horrified protest as he fell with his arms spread wide. She dove after him, catching him in a matter of milliseconds after his leap of faith. Johnny got a vague impression of a small dark mass falling past him as she caught him. She'd been carrying something and had dropped it to be rid of the extra weight. Smooth scaled forelegs wrapped around his upper torso just under his arms, her hot breath gusting in desperate pants just above his head. Little girl's feathered wings beat frantically to slow his descent to the rocky ground below. Johnny did his best to help her by trying not to move too much and cause his weight to shift around. He also tried not to act as terrified as he felt. If he panicked, so would she, and possibly causing her to make a fatal mistake. Thanks to the moonless sky, he couldn't see anything beyond little girl's beating wings. Below, it was almost pitch black at the base of the cliff, and he couldn't see how fast they were descending. Fortunately, little girl's eyes would have no trouble seeing in the dark. She could see well enough for both of them. Little girl made high distressed whistling noises every exhale as she strained to save her father's life. Her wings beat harder as she redoubled her efforts to slow them down, and he could literally feel her frantically slamming heartbeat between his shoulder blades where her chest was pressed firmly up against him. The controlled fall and rush of wind seemed to last forever, and Johnny began to worry that they may not make it. Then he could just make out the starlit ground just a few yards below his hanging feet. It was coming up fast, almost too fast. He gritted his teeth and braced for impact as he resisted the urge to tell little girl to slow down. He knew she was doing her best. "Oof!" he said as the wind was knocked out of him and he finally hit the ground and tumbled sideways. He was nearly slammed into a thorn bush when she was forced to drop him a couple of feet off the ground to avoid crash landing on top of him and injuring them both in the impact. Fortunately, the satchel little girl had dropped and had landed in front of the bush, and it served to help stop his roll before he wound up in a rather prickly situation. He sat up panting and looked around to see if little girl was all right. She was fine, and seriously pissed off. She had landed a few feet away to his left, with her eagle wings and elongated triangular head drooping tiredly. Tongue lolling, her mouth hung agape as she panted hard to catch her breath, causing her flanks to heave with every inhale and exhale. Her furiously glaring yellow eyes flashed dimly in the starlight as they fixed on him as she lifted her head. They were wet with tears that had been blown back during their descent. Her tail lashed back and forth like an angry cat, her jaws hanging open as she breathed in great steaming gusts of the cold night air. She bared her fangs and emitted a short growl. "Sorry, sweetie," Johnny apologized with complete sincerity as he tried to catch his own breath. "I'll make it up to you, all right?" The little girl barked angrily, hopped on her forelegs, and landing stiffly with a soft thump and kicking up small puffs of dust with her front feet. Before she could make any further comment, her attention was suddenly diverted by a sound Johnny didn't catch at first. The shadowy form of her head whipped to the right and upward, then she snarled viciously. Then he heard it as Goldie finally came out of hiding and curled up in his lap. Engine noise from some of the trucks as the guards started them. He knew there was a way to drive down from up there, and it would only be a matter of time before they found it. He turned to Little Girl and asked, "Can you fly?" Little Girl lifted her wings experimentally and chuffed an affirmative. "Good." Johnny grabbed the satchel with its unknown contents. Untying the sheath from Goldie's back, he replaced the knife that he somehow managed to hang on to, placed both in the sack, and gently tossed it to Little Girl. She caught it deftly in her forepaws as Johnny stood up with Goldie in his arms and placed her on Little Girl's withers. Goldie clung tightly to the dragon's feather mane with all 4 feet, readying herself for takeoff. Little Girl launched herself up into the air with Johnny running along behind her. They went like this all night, stopping only briefly to catch their breaths. Luckily, Johnny's attacks were not too frequent, and they managed to recover quickly enough not to slow them down too much.